Hello economics students, in this video we're going to look at how we actually measure or calculate the budget outcome in an accounting sense. And really we're looking at one measurement, which is called the underlying cash balance. And we're going to measure the outcome in dollar terms. So is it a deficit or surplus, $4 billion surplus, or a negative $30 billion deficit, or a $30 billion deficit I should say. And then we're going to take that underlying cash balance and we're going to measure it as a proportion of GDP. So we're going to look at this measurement down the bottom in percentage terms and this measurement up the top in dollar terms. Okay, now you may recall the underlying and headline language, which we're going to look at here when we measure the underlying cash balance, is similar or sounds familiar because we've used it before when we were looking at the underlying and headline inflation rates. And the concepts or the theory is the same here. We start at the top with the headline, the head is at the top, and that includes everything, all the data, right? All the inflation data, the total CPI, or in this case, all revenues, which is all receipts for the government, and all expenses, which is all payments for the government, over a certain period, which is over the financial year, June to July, and we're going to measure that on a cash accounting basis, which means we measure the revenues when we receive them, or on receipt, or the expenses on payment. So all the transactions that came into the government's bank account and all the transactions that went out of the government's bank account over a financial year, and that is the headline outcome or the headline cash balance. But we're not so concerned with the headline cash balance in budgetary policy. What we're really trying to understand is the underlying cash balance. And for the same reasons that we're interested in underlying inflation, because what we do is we remove one-off or non-recurring items that would actually skew the data and make the budget outcome look better or worse than it actually is. So what are we removing? We're removing net cash flows from investments in financial assets. So let's break this down a little bit. The net part means that we're removing both receipts, so receipts into the bank account of the government, and payments out of the bank account of the government. And we're measuring receipts and payments that are relating to investments in financial assets. Okay, so some examples are an investment into the NBN, or the repayment of a loan, or the payment of a loan to another country. Remember, these are non-recurring, so if we received money for selling of a financial asset, that usually happens once, and so we need to remove it to get a better picture of what the actual underlying cash balance is. Let's have a look at the government's budget. So it actually works in reverse. We start up here with the underlying cash balance, and that's because sort of only budget nerds like myself actually care about the headline cash balance. It's not as widely reported, and basically when you listen to the media, they're always going to be talking about the underlying cash balance. You can see we have a $4 billion surplus. But how do we get to this $4 billion surplus? Well, we start down here with the headline, so we're going to start backwards, and we added up all receipts and all payments over the 2022 to 23 financial year. We added them up and we found that we had a deficit down here of $7 billion. But what we have to do is we have to remove from this headline deficit the net cash flows from investment in financial assets, which are all these things here. Remember I said it's receipts and payments. So we might have made a payment for student loans for some HECS. We received a loan repayment from the government, from NBN. We made a payment to the infrastructure facility, and we received some structured finance, $295 million. We received a loan back from Indonesia. Now, you don't need to know these individually or the receipts and payments, but you need to know that we add all these things up and we look at it in net terms. So we add all these things up and they equal negative $11 billion. Now, to get our underlying balance, we take the headline, which is negative 7, and we minus negative 11. So that means negative 7 plus 11 equals 4, because two negatives turn into a positive. And you can see up here is our underlying balance. All right, but we also need to measure the underlying cash balance as a proportion of GDP, as a proportion of the size of the economy. And this makes sense because if we had, say, a $20 billion deficit, but economic growth or GDP was only $40 billion, Well, the underlying cash balance as a percentage of GDP, which would just be 20 billion divided by 40 billion times 100, would be 50%, which is pretty bad. But if we had a different economy that's also had a $20 billion deficit, but the size of the economy was 1 trillion, well, that's only a 2% deficit as a proportion of GDP. Much less worse. So let's have a look at the Australian governments, because we do actually quote both. So this is also from the budget papers, and you can see here that the underlying cash balance, our dollar figure, is $4.2 billion. But we're also going to measure that as a percentage of GDP, or 0.2%. A couple of interesting things here. The underlying cash balance in 2021-22 was $32 billion. We're estimating that in 2024-25 it's going to be $35 billion, but the percentage of GDP is less. So in 2022, it's 1.4% of GDP, but in 2024, it's 1.3% of GDP. And all that means is that the size of the economy is getting larger, or the denominator is getting larger, even though the deficit is getting larger too. So keep that in mind. A couple of key takeaways very quickly. If the deficit grows in line with GDP, well, that's kind of neutral, that should be. If the deficit grows at a slower pace, or the deficit's decreasing and the GDP is increasing, well, that's a good thing, because your underlying cash balance as a percentage of GDP will be decreasing. And I guess the only bad thing would be if the deficit grows faster than GDP, because that would increase the underlying cash balance as a percentage of GDP. This video is going too long, so you can calculate them in your own time. All right, if you have any questions, reach out in the comments. Bye for now.